Before recorded history, before the shaping of mountains and rivers, Middle-earth lay in a fragile silence, a world suspended between music and void. In that vast emptiness, even the light of the Valar trembled against the faint stirrings of something older, something patient. It was not yet named, not yet recognized, but its presence pressed against the edges of creation, soft as a shadow passing through a dream. From this quiet prelude, the first whispers of evil emerged, not in the form of open war or blazing fire, but in subtle distortions, in the bending of wills, in the gentle seduction of pride and ambition. The lands themselves, though untouched by mortal hand, bore the first traces of imbalance, their forms shaped not solely by the harmony of the Ainur, but also by a silent, insidious force that sought to leave its mark. In these early ages, the Valar observed with concern the flickering possibilities, aware that even the smallest seed of disobedience or corruption could ripple outward through time. Mountains rose taller here, valleys deepened there, and in the shadows of those nascent forms, unseen patterns began to gather. From these patterns, the first dark dominions would emerge, later known as Morgoth's strongholds, though at this point they were nothing more than concentrations of latent power, unclaimed and waiting. It was in the shaping of these realms that the first bargains were struck, not by armies or kings, but by subtle negotiations between intention and chance, between desire and restraint. The cost of these bargains was rarely immediate. It was woven into the fabric of the world, to reveal itself slowly, inexorably, across generations. Even among the first children of LOTR, the elves who would awaken beside the waters of Cuiviénen, there was an unspoken awareness, a delicate instinct that not all that shone was safe. Their songs, harmonious and full of reverence, resonated across the shaping lands, yet some tones faltered, slipping into dissonance that would echo through time. These subtle shifts were not mistakes, nor were they signs of weakness. They were the first threads of a larger tapestry, one in which shadow and light would forever entwine. The elders among the elves whispered of presences that moved silently, shaping thoughts, inspiring curiosity, and occasionally an unacknowledged fear. Even in these nascent ages, the concept of moral cost existed, though it was unseen, a burden carried in the undercurrent of creation itself. The shadow's influence was patient, deliberate, and undetectable to most. It did not yet take form in fire or malice, nor did it compel obedience through fear. It operated through suggestion, through the quiet pressure of choice and desire, planting questions and possibilities in minds and landscapes alike. A valley might feel lonelier than intended, a mountain pass steeper, a forest denser. These were not accidents, but early expressions of a principle that would guide the shaping of evil in the world. That influence is strongest when it appears as freedom, when the choices offered seem natural, inevitable, even desirable. Among the Valar, debate stirred over whether intervention would suffice, whether early containment could prevent the unraveling of harmony. Yet intervention carried its own cost. The balance of order and freedom was delicate. Even a single misstep might accelerate the very distortions they hoped to prevent. Thus, the early history of Middle-earth was marked by restraint, observation, and the quiet weighing of consequences, as the Valar allowed the world to evolve, knowing that the first great trials of shadow and light lay in the distant, unrecorded ages. From these unassuming beginnings, the first visible signs of the shadow's design began to appear. Isolated murmurs of corruption among creatures yet unnamed, the first distortions of elemental will, and the faint glimmer of objects imbued with subtle, lingering purpose. Though the world was young, the mechanisms of influence were already at work, operating in cycles and patterns that would endure across millennia. These early forces would set the stage for the tragic interplay of destiny, courage, and corruption that defines the histories of men, elves, dwarves, and even the lesser-known races. And so the first threads of shadow were laid, quiet as a sigh, deep as the forming roots of mountains. The listener, seated in the calm of reflection, begins to perceive the invisible shaping of a world, a sense of inevitability wrapped in patient design. How could such distant stirrings, subtle and patient, bend the courses of kings and the lives of the smallest folk alike? What mechanisms, unseen and intricate, would transform these early distortions into realms of consequence, where choices echo across generations? These questions linger in the stillness, inviting the next step, a closer look at the first dark realms themselves, where shadow moves from potential into form. The world had shape now. Mountains reared their spines into the sky, rivers traced silver veins across the land, and forests whispered in their own slow, leafy tongues. But in the far north, where the light faltered earliest and the winds carried more silence than song, something darker began to take form. It was not merely land or fortress. It was intention made place, Angband. The iron prison, carved beneath the black roots of the Thangorodrim. This was no ordinary stronghold, but the first true realm of darkness in Middle-earth, and it was built by the hand of Melkor, now called Morgoth, the rebel of the music, the exiled Valar, who no longer sought harmony, but dominion. It did not rise in haste. Morgoth's methods were slow and deliberate, like sediment settling at the bottom of a forgotten sea. His realm was shaped not by stone alone, but by will, by a force that corrupted the materials it touched. Iron did not simply rust, it groaned with memory. Walls bled heat, long after the forges fell silent. Even silence within Angband was not absence, but a waiting pressure, thick with suppressed movement. It was here that shadow gained its first true throne, and the evil that had only whispered in the margins now spoke with voice and form. Angband was not merely a place to house armies. It was a forge of transformation. Deep in its furnaces, fire was taught to obey rage rather than warmth. Beasts were broken and rebuilt into monsters, wargs, with minds sharper than wolves, spiders that hungered for thought as much as flesh. And in its darkest chambers, spirits that had once shimmered in the light of Ea were twisted into the Balrogs, those terrible Maya who traded radiance for ruin. Morgoth had not merely crafted soldiers, he had redefined what a servant of shadow could be. But perhaps the most dangerous thing he forged was not creature or weapon, but belief. In Angband, Morgoth wove the first convincing illusion that the world was his to shape. He spoke to those who strayed too close. Elves curious about the far lands, men newly awakened and naive to the stakes of choice. He offered safety in return for loyalty, truth in exchange for silence, and some accepted. That was the quiet victory. Not the battles that would follow, but the early yielding of will. Elves were the first to be taken, their minds seduced by false promises or broken by pain too complex to describe. What happened to them in the chambers beneath Angband is not fully recorded, nor should it be recounted in haste. But from them came the orcs, twisted parodies of the firstborn, born not of nature but of desecration. This act alone changed the moral fabric of the world. Evil was no longer merely a force. It had lineage, memory, and cruelty embedded in its very survival. Other fortresses would follow. Autumno, older and colder, had been Morgoth's first experiment in tyranny. But Angband endured longer, and it was there that his malice rooted itself into the land like rot in old wood. Every choice made within its shadow seemed bent by some unseen weight. Even the stars above its peaks dimmed, as if unwilling to shine upon what had taken root below. Artifacts forged in Angband would outlive the realm itself. Blades that remembered screams, helms that echoed with command, chains that had bound more than flesh. These relics, scattered across future wars and fallen hordes, whispered of the deep cost of contact with a realm that had never truly slept. And yet, the most dangerous mechanism of Angband was not its fire, nor its beasts, but its ability to extend its logic outward. It did not need to be present to corrupt. It needed only to be remembered. Its shadow traveled through memory and rumor, spreading across tongues and texts, becoming fear itself, a contagious thought that could weaken resolve before the first sword was drawn. So it was that the first Dark Realm taught Middle-earth the rules of enduring corruption. That evil is patient, that it disguises itself as necessity, and that even the strongest lands falter when they do not understand the cost of what they resist. By the time Morgoth's fortress stood in full power, even those who had never seen its walls carried its weight. Elven kings debated what was worth protecting. Dwarven halls began to seal their gates. Men built towers not for beauty, but for warning. And in the quiet lands still untouched by shadow, the soil had already begun to remember the shape of ruin. What then made these places so enduring? Why do their effects echo even after they fall to ruin? If Morgoth's dominion was broken, why do his tools still stir beneath mountains and in dreams? To answer that, we must look to the mortal realms that followed, to the way ambition, grief, and cleverness opened doors just wide enough for shadow to enter and never leave. The shadow had found its voice in Angband, and now it sought ears. It did not shout, it whispered. It did not strike, it offered. And it was through this quiet persuasion that the mortal realms were drawn into its design, each in their own way. Dwarves were the first to feel the resonance of things beneath the earth. Their halls were carved deep, their pride bound to stone and craft, and within those stone song echoes, darker harmonies sometimes answered. It was not always malign at first. There were veins of ore that shimmered with unnatural brilliance, metals that hummed with promise. But as the dwarves dug deeper, so too did the shadow reach upward. It did not need to destroy them. It needed only to be welcomed. In time, greed shaped the rhythm of their delving, not simply for treasure, but for mastery. Subtle thoughts grew louder, that to claim was to deserve, that to shape was to rule. These were not lies, but half-truths, and half-truths are the bones upon which deeper corruption builds. The shadow did not break the dwarves. It bent them, until their silence grew cavernous, and their pride became a wall too thick for warning to pass through. For men, the seduction was swifter. They had awoken later, under starlight already dimmed by the long reach of Morgoth. Their short lives made them quick to act, eager to define, to control. When the shadow approached them, it came not in terror, but in flattery. It spoke to their yearning for power, for legacy, for permanence. And in this it found fertile ground. From scattered tribes and fledgling settlements rose leaders who accepted unseen aid. Harvests improved after certain rituals. Wars were won with uncanny foresight. Fortunes shifted where no coin had changed hands. And though the price was not always demanded at once, it was never forgotten. A bloodline twisted, a region blighted, a ruler disappeared without trace, his name spoken only in fearful riddles. This was the genius of the early shadow, that it did not need war to expand. It needed only ambition, grief, and time. Mortals carried these freely. In one realm, a dwarven king sealed away a relic that whispered in his sleep. In another, a chieftain of men built a tower on land that wept when touched. These were not obvious tragedies. They were slow rewritings of destiny, altering not what people did, but what they believed was possible. Even the elves, eldest of the children of Ilúvatar, were not immune. Though more resistant, their greatest strength, Their memory was also their burden. They remembered the light of Valinor, and in their longing to preserve beauty, some grew desperate. It was in these moments that shadow found its entry, not through force, but through the ache of preservation, the idea that what was fair could be made eternal, and that eternity required control. And so, the foundations were laid. Realms rose with unseen cracks already spreading through their stones. Relationships were forged with debts hidden between words. Even joy was not exempt. In one corner of the world, a child might laugh, not knowing the land beneath their feet had once been sanctified, and now lay cursed. The shadow had no need to conquer the world, not when it could teach the world to conquer itself. Each act of pride, each forgotten warning, each small compromise made room for deeper influence. In time, entire bloodlines would carry its echo, unaware that their choices echoed a logic not entirely their own. What began in the secret halls of Angband now resonated across valleys and cities. Its influence was no longer confined to a fortress or battlefield. It existed in inheritance, in tradition, in the unspoken assumptions of power. Yet, not all influence was permanent. Some resisted. There were whispers of leaders who sensed the change and stepped away. Small realms where songs held old truth, books burned before they could teach the wrong names. And yet, these flickers of defiance were scattered, unconnected. The shadow thrived in the spaces between them. The question, then, was not whether the shadow had spread. It had. The question was how it sustained itself so effortlessly, without armies or declarations. The answer lies not in people, but in the objects they revered, in the relics, tools, and gifts passed down through ages. What are these artifacts that do not age as their wielders do? What forces linger in the curve of a ring, the haft of a blade, the stone in a crown? If the mortal realms were vulnerable, then perhaps it was through these very objects that their downfall was secured. There are objects in Middle-earth that do not merely endure time, they bend it, rings that whisper in silence, blades that never dull, stones that reflect not light, but will. These are not mere heirlooms or feats of craftsmanship. They are vessels of intent, fragments of power, shaped by hands that understood how to anchor shadow in the material world. And each of them, whether gifted, forged, or stolen, carries with it not only strength but a price. The rings of power are most often named, and rightly so. Their creation marked a pivotal shift in how evil moved through the world, not by assault, but by offer. They were crafted with precision, with beauty, with apparent benevolence. To the elves, the art of ring-making was a form of preservation, an attempt to arrest decay and maintain the glories of an earlier age. But beneath that intent lurked another, a desire to control what could not be owned: time, mortality, memory. It was this desire that Sauron, in a fair guise, nurtured like a gardener tending roots he had buried himself. He did not begin by making the One Ring. First he taught, gently, convincingly. He instructed the elven smiths of Eregion, speaking as one who understood the world's fragility. Under his guidance they forged rings that could heal, protect, enhance. But these rings, though powerful, were incomplete. It was only when Sauron withdrew to the fires of Mount Doom that he crafted the One Ring, pouring into it not only domination but the mechanism was simple and profound. The One Ring was a master key. It did not command through noise, but through resonance. When worn, it sought out the other rings, not to destroy them, but to influence them. In doing so, it did not simply corrupt the objects, it reshaped the bearers. 9 rings went to men, and through them, kings became wraiths. Not in a single night, but over decades. At first, they grew in power, wealth, command. They were loved, feared, admired, and yet, slowly, each began to fade, first from history, then from flesh. Their wills, once sharp, were softened into instruments. By the time they became the Nazgul, they were not merely servants of Sauron. They were echoes of themselves, suspended between breath and obedience. 7 rings were given to dwarves, and here the results were less absolute, but no less tragic. Dwarves are hardy, resistant to domination. But the rings did not need to control them. They only needed to amplify what already stirred in their hearts. And so, their greed grew, not for gold alone, but for dominion, for hoards that stretched deeper than any hall could hold. This greed bred isolation, suspicion, and in time, ruin. The dragons came later, drawn to the scent of excess, but the sickness had already taken root. 3 rings remained with the elves, hidden, guarded. These were crafted without Sauron's direct touch, and so retained a clarity others lacked. Yet even they were not beyond influence. The very act of hiding them shaped the decisions of their bearers. To wield them was to feel time slipping through the fingers more slowly. Yes, but it also meant withdrawal, retreat, the slow turning away from the world they once guided. Beyond the rings, other relics held weight. Morgoth's crown, once bearing the Silmarils, was not simply regalia, it was a prison for light, twisted into pride. Blades such as Gurthang, which drank the blood of both friend and foe, carried the memory of every life they ended. Palantiri, the seeing stones, offered vision, yet so easily blurred desire with truth. These objects did not merely change hands, they altered the path of every hand that held them. And more than that, they remembered, not as minds do, but as wells remember what was poured into them. Their aura endured. A ring lost in the river would still call to the desperate. A sword buried in a ruin would still hum when touched by wrath. A stone once held by a king would still show his downfall, even to a stranger. This is the legacy of shadow-bound relics. They persist, and in persisting, they participate, not passively, but subtly, reshaping the intentions of those who encounter them. Even when untouched, their legend alone shapes choice. Some kings rose because of what they sought. Others fell for what they feared to find. If evil first entered the world through intent, then these relics became its vessels. They made shadow portable, an inheritance wrapped in metal and gem. And so long after Morgoth was chained, and long before Sauron's form returned, the world was already preparing itself for their return. The tools were waiting. And if such objects could shape the fates of individuals, what of nations? What happens when thrones are built atop forgotten bargains, when crowns weigh more than gold? To answer that, we must step into the courts of kings and trace how the corruption of artifacts became the corruption of leadership. In the quiet halls of power, where the sound of footfalls echoes like history itself, corruption does not arrive with banners or flames. It enters through counsel, through lineage, through crown. A throne in Middle-earth is not merely a seat, it is a fulcrum, a place where unseen forces converge and reshape the fate of entire realms. And when shadow touches such a place, it does not need to shout. It only needs to whisper into the ear of a king. Consider Numenor, the island gifted to men, raised from the sea as a reward for loyalty in the wars against Morgoth. For a time, it was radiant, filled with wisdom, craft, and longevity. Its kings were tall, noble, and wise, and yet it was there that one of the deepest falls unfolded, not through immediate violence, but through gradual forgetting. The shadow that Sauron had inherited from Morgoth returned in a form more insidious than any open army. When Sauron was brought to Numenor as a captive, he did not resist. He smiled. He studied, and in time, he advised. His presence near the throne of Ar-Pharazôn became an infection, subtle and profound. He spoke of power beyond the sea, of the folly of mortality, of secrets the Valar denied to men. And the king, proud and aging, listened. The mechanism here was not sorcery, but flattery, not a spell, but the deliberate placement of doubt. Sauron did not need to declare war on Númenor. He simply steered its heart away from the west, toward the illusion of self-made divinity. Temples rose, sacrifices followed, and the throne, once a symbol of gratitude, became a pedestal for fear and worship. Elsewhere in Middle-earth, thrones did not fall so spectacularly, but they bent slowly. Gondor, proud heir to Númenorian legacy, bore the weight of both greatness and vulnerability. Its kings carried the memories of what had been lost, and in that remembrance, a longing took root. The Palantiri, seeing stones, offered vision, and thus reassurance. But when touched by a will stronger and more practiced in deception, those visions shifted. It is said that Denethor, steward of Gondor, looked into one such stone and saw ruin. And though what he saw was not false, it was incomplete. The shadow does not need to lie if it can offer only part of the truth. Denethor, believing all hope lost, ceased to act as a guardian of his people and instead became their mourner in advance. Here lies the most enduring mechanism of corruption among rulers, despair shaped as foresight. When kings see only doom, they shape their realm to meet it. Fortresses turn inward, laws grow harsh, trust withers, a throne touched by shadow becomes less a seat of wisdom, and more a mirror reflecting fear back upon the people. But shadow also operated through succession. Bloodlines were its hidden battlegrounds. The heirs of Isildur carried both great burden and great temptation. Isildur himself had claimed the One Ring from Sauron, not to destroy it, but to possess it, and though he fell shortly after, the choice rippled forward. His line became both the hope of men and the echo of their failings. Strider, known later as Aragorn, bore that legacy with care, but it took long wandering and deep trials before he was ready to take the throne of Gondor. The crown he eventually wore was not merely metal, it was the weight of history, of choices made before he was born. And his struggle, unlike that of Denethor or Ar-Pharazôn, was not against enemies alone, but against the allure of becoming what he fought. A throne once touched by shadow remains marked. Even when cleansed, the memory lingers. Rulers who follow must navigate not only laws and battles, but the lingering logic of corruption. It shapes expectations, distorts counsel, and offers convenient paths that lead to slow unraveling. In many cases, the throne's failure was not due to a single act, but to patterns, small decisions made under pressure, each one defensible, even noble. But the pattern itself became a net, drawing leaders away from clarity and into narratives shaped by fear, pride, or grief. Such is the enduring cost of shadow in the halls of power. It teaches that control is safety, that vision is sovereignty, that doubt is weakness. And in doing so, it reshapes the very nature of leadership, not as service, but as possession. To understand how deep this influence runs, we must look not only at kings and stewards, but at those who stood near them, advisors, warriors, wanderers, figures who bore the same temptations yet chose differently. What separates the fallen from the spared? What unseen currents shield a heart or expose it? To explore that question, we must turn now to the individuals who bore the burden of greatness without crowns, those whose heroism trembled on the edge of corruption. Not all burdens sit on thrones. Some are carried in silence across mountains, through fire, into memory. And those who bear them are often mistaken for wanderers, captains, scribes, or fools. Yet it is they, those unguarded by ceremony and unarmored by title, who often walk closest to the shadow's edge. For the great danger of evil is not only its ambition to rule, but its quiet attempt to infiltrate virtue, to bend it just slightly off course. Heroes in Middle-earth were not forged by acclaim. They were defined by restraint, by choosing silence where pride would shout, by standing still where fear would flee. But even the brightest among them stood beneath a sky that was not entirely clear. Every act of courage cast a shadow behind it, and the shadow waited. Boromir, son of Gondor, beloved and burdened, was a man of valor. He fought not for conquest, but for kin, for city, for the echo of what his people once were. Yet it was this very nobility that left him vulnerable. The One Ring called to him not as a temptation of greed, but as a solution, a path, a weapon that could defend his realm where diplomacy had failed and swords had dulled. He did not fall in a moment of weakness, but in a moment of clarity, the twisted kind born of desperation, when the line between salvation and surrender blurs. His attempt to take the ring was not the act of a villain, but of a man convinced that the end justified the means. And that, precisely, is the shadow's quiet art. It does not need to corrupt, it only needs to reframe. The tragedy of Boromir is not only that he faltered, but that he believed himself righteous while doing so. Even Gandalf, Maya of the elder days, felt the weight of temptation. When offered the ring, he refused it, not because he lacked the strength to wield it, but because he feared he did not possess the restraint to stop wielding it. He knew more than most that power taken in the name of good can calcify into tyranny more swiftly than any open malice. It was not ignorance that spared him. It was wisdom sharpened by humility. Galadriel, radiant and terrible in her knowing, stood upon the same threshold. She had ruled, resisted, and remembered for longer than most realms had stood. And Frodo offered her the ring. She saw not just herself, but the image of what she could become, beautiful and dreadful, a queen whom all would love and despair. And it was this vision that allowed her to turn away, to choose diminishment rather than dominion. Her strength was not in what she could have taken, but in what she chose to leave untouched. Even Aragorn, heir to forgotten kings, walked close to the flame. For years he moved through the world as a shadow of what he might be, not out of fear, but caution. He knew that lineage alone did not make a ruler. If he were to claim the crown of Gondor, he would do so not as a claimant, but as a servant of a higher design. His long silence was not hesitation. It was resistance, a refusal to become a vessel for the pride that had ruined his ancestors. And yet, the greatest bearer of Shadow's burden was Frodo, not because he sought it, but because he could not avoid it. The ring did not tempt him with empire or glory. It wore him down by inches, through sleepless nights, through visions that bled into waking, through the sheer weight of being watched, always, by something just behind the veil. His strength was not in resisting temptation with fire, but in carrying its cold presence without surrendering to despair. But even Frodo at the end could not cast the ring away. In the moment of climax it claimed him, and it was not virtue that saved the world, but the twisted, accidental mercy born of an earlier act, the sparing of Gollum. Another soul bent by the same object, another mirror to Frodo's path. That fall, that bite, that stumble into fire, was not redemption, it was consequence. This, then, is the heart of Shadow's test upon the heroic. That even their strength becomes a blade with two edges, that righteousness can be weaponized, that mercy and memory must walk hand in hand, or both will fail. In the end, it is not about who resists entirely, for none do. It is about who returns, who, having walked through the dark, chooses not to build there, and who, when given power, releases it. Yet even among these stories of resistance, the cost remains. wounds that do not close, eyes that no longer see the world as they once did. Kingdoms rebuilt upon ashes, the shadow leaves not only scars, but echoes. And if war brings such trials to the few, what then of the many? What of the armies who marched at their side, the kingdoms drawn into the web? To understand the reach of shadow, we must turn to war itself, not its glory, but its machinery. In war, evil does not always reveal itself in the enemy's armor. More often, it lives in the silences before battle, in the decisions whispered in tents lit by fading lanterns, in the reasons given to men for why they must march. Shadow thrives in conflict, not simply through chaos, but through coordination, manipulating motives, controlling timing, and ensuring that wars break out not for victory, but for inevitability. By the time great armies clashed in Middle-earth, the battles were not isolated acts of aggression. They were the end result of decades, sometimes centuries, of quiet orchestration. The shadow did not need to ignite every war. It needed only to ensure that the world remained slightly off balance, that peace never quite settled, that alliances always trembled, and that fear could be passed from one generation to the next, like a sharpened heirloom. The war of the dwarves and orcs, long before the ring resurfaced, was a conflict born not only of revenge, but of something deeper, the festering of grief. The dwarves, mourning their own and guarding old grudges, descended into the depths of Moria with fury. Yet the orcs were waiting. It was no accident. There had been whispers, sightings, provocations carefully spaced, carefully timed, as if someone somewhere needed both peoples exhausted. Wars like these drained the strong, disbanded the proud, and created vacancies in the power structure of Middle-earth. Vacancies which the shadow filled, not with open claim, but with the slow return of old powers, buried deep and long thought dormant. Sauron, though not yet named again, watched these battles from afar, and where his eye did not reach, his will traveled through agents and artifacts alike. Later, as Gondor and Rohan prepared for the wars of the Third Age, the signs of orchestration grew clearer. Armies of Mordor did not simply arise. They emerged with purpose, striking at precise moments when defenses were weakest. When morale was fractured, Haradrim and Easterlings marched under Sauron's banners, not because they had been enslaved, but because they had been convinced by history, by resentment, by the slow rewriting of truth. And even among the free peoples, the mechanisms of war became tainted. Rohan's king, Theoden, once a mighty rider, fell into torpor not by sword or sickness, but by speech. Grima Wormtongue, his advisor, whispered weakness into the heart of strength, until the kingdom's will atrophied. This was no brute force tactic. It was warfare of the spirit. And in this, the shadow proved that victory need not come through conquest. A silent king is as effective as a dead one. But the most telling proof of Shadow's hand in warfare lies not in how battles began, but in what they cost. Each war pushed the realms closer to exhaustion, to fragmentation. Cities were rebuilt thinner, alliances less sure. Even the victors emerged diminished. Sauron understood what Morgoth had once learned too late, that outright domination inspires revolt, but erosion ensures compliance. There were still moments of valor, of sacrifice and resistance. Helm's Deep stood. Minas Tirith endured. But each of these victories was accompanied by a quiet reckoning, that strength alone would not sustain the world, and that courage, if not guarded by wisdom, would be spent faster than it could be renewed. Even Frodo's path to Mordor, though cloaked in secrecy, was shaped by this larger machinery of distraction. The great battles were not merely shields, they were part of the design. Every horn sounded in Gondor echoed as cover for a footstep in the dark. Sauron's eye drawn outward left a narrow opening through which hope might pass. That this hope required so much blood to preserve is the cruel balance shadow always maintains. What emerges from this reflection is not only the scope of evil's planning, but the precision of its patience. Shadow does not rush, it waits. It shapes outcomes, not through domination, but through exhaustion, through the slow reordering of what people believe is possible. And after war, what remains? Not peace, but quiet. The kind that leaves room for rebuilding, yes, but also for forgetting, for letting vigilance fade. In those quiet years, Sauron rebuilt Barad-dûr. The Nazgûl searched. The ring passed from hand to hand. So it is that the wars of Middle-earth, while epic in memory, were not the climax of Shadow's strategy. They were maintenance, necessary cycles to ensure the world remained distracted, fractured, and weakened. If armies could be moved like pieces, what of individuals? If whole kingdoms were deceived, how much more easily could a family, a village, a province be turned with less force and more promise? To answer this, we turn to the long game. Sauron's design not only on battlefield and throne, but on the everyday lives of those who never saw the eye, yet still served it. Barad-dûr did not rise in haste. It rose in silence, behind veils of secrecy and centuries of careful design. Sauron, though cast down, had not vanished. His body was broken, his armies scattered, but his will remained, and it was will more than stone or steel that built the Dark Tower. Not as a monument, but as a fulcrum, a place where every strand of shadow could converge, radiate, and pull the distant corners of Middle-earth into quiet alignment. He did not need to conquer cities with force when he could conquer decisions with doubt. Sauron understood what Morgoth had only learned at the end, that brute power attracts resistance, but influence reshapes without notice. And so, in the long centuries after his first defeat, Sauron moved not as a conqueror, but as a whisper. He wore no crown, he bore no name. He became a shadow behind thrones, a silence in old forests, a presence that reshaped decisions before they were spoken aloud. His agents were not all wraiths. Some were men, convinced of their righteousness. Others were beasts, reshaped in darkness. But the most dangerous were the unseen, the ideas, beliefs, rumors that passed from tongue to tongue. That the West had abandoned the East, that the strength of elves was waning, that peace was a pretense, and only power endured. These were not lies, but slow poisons. The Palantiri, once tools of communication, became instruments of distortion. What they showed was not always false, but always framed. Sauron, holding the Master Stone, could tilt the view, omit the crucial moment, emphasize the ruin. And through this lens, he influenced even the wise. Denethor, the steward of Gondor, believed what he saw, and in doing so, shaped the very future he feared. Through such tools, Sauron did not need to destroy hope. He only needed to make it seem foolish. A waste of strength, a remnant of a vanished age. In this way, resistance faltered long before battle, and while armies still trained, while towers were still lit with watchful fire, within the hearts of many surrender had already begun. The Nazgûl, bound by the 9 rings, were his most visible agents, but their terror was only the surface. Their presence frayed the soul. Their cries did not summon fear alone. They summoned memory, grief, longing. Towns would lock their gates, not just out of danger, but out of despair, and when they passed, something was always lost. Names forgotten, trees that would not grow again, dreams that dissolved upon waking. But Sauron's reach extended further still. He understood that not all must be conquered. Some need only be distracted. Trade routes in the east were twisted. Small skirmishes bloomed in far regions where no banner of Mordor flew, supplies delayed, loyalties tested, all of it orchestrated from afar, and in this way, while Gondor looked south and Rohan looked west, the world was slowly turned toward Barad-dûr's gravity. Even his own image became a tool. The eye, no longer a face, no longer a voice, was a symbol of total observation. To be seen was to be known was to be vulnerable, and thus men began to hide not only their actions, but their thoughts. They mistrusted one another. Secrets became currency. And the eye, whether it watched or not, remained open in every mind it had touched. Sauron's brilliance lay not in domination, but in design. He did not merely want the world to fall, he wanted it to shape itself into his vision, where power was worshipped, where obedience was safety, and where fear was the only constant. And this vision did not begin at the gates of Mordor. It began in decisions made far from war, a merchant who changed his route, a soldier who questioned his oath, a leader who delayed one day too long. By the time the ring surfaced again, Barad-dûr was already complete. Its walls were dark as memory, its foundations rooted not only in earth, but in every compromised promise, every bargain made in haste. And while its tower rose visibly, its true architecture spread invisibly, through hearts, through dreams, through histories rewritten. This is the true shadow, not a force marching under banners, but a map of choices reshaped across time, a world bent gently toward ruin, until its people believe that ruin is natural, perhaps even deserved. And yet, not all lands bent so easily. There were corners of Middle-earth untouched by banners or palantiri, small realms where silence had a different meaning, where the shadow's reach dimmed. To understand how evil spreads, we must also understand where it falters, where small folk, far from thrones and towers, resisted not with swords, but with memory, with kindness, with stubborn, unspoken hope. There is a kind of strength that does not shout, and a kind of resistance that does not ride into war. It is quiet, stubborn, and often unnoticed, woven into small lives, small places, small choices that refuse to bend. In the great sweep of Middle-earth's history, filled with thrones, towers, and swords, there remain pockets of stillness where the shadow passed overhead, but could not settle. These were the small realms, hobbit holes, distant villages, hidden woods, where the great eye did not look, not because it could not, but because it did not yet see the danger in what it overlooked. The Shire was one such place. It was not guarded by walls. No army patrolled its borders. And yet it endured, not through power, but through a refusal to play the same game. The hobbits, by design or fate, lived in rhythms older than ambition. They planted in spring, harvested in autumn, and spoke little of kings. Their joys were small, and therefore resilient. And because the shadow works best through fear, and through desire, it found little foothold in a people who feared little and desired only to be left alone. But the shadow did not forget them, not entirely. When Frodo carried the ring into the wider world, the Shire became more than quiet land. It became a memory of what the world once was, a world unbroken, a world before the great powers rose and fell. And in that memory lay its danger. Sauron did not understand the hobbits, and what evil does not understand, it tries to erase. Saruman, once wise, saw what Sauron did not. In his fall, he turned his attention toward the small, not with reverence, but with scorn. He sent men to the Shire, not in armies, but in wagons. They brought rules, they brought hunger, they brought a grey weight upon the green. And still, resistance stirred, not with swords, but with stubbornness. It was in these places that courage was not born of prophecy, but of refusal. Refusal to leave, refusal to forget, refusal to allow the world to be rewritten by those who saw only power. Samwise Gamgee did not study law. He did not lead soldiers, but he walked beside Frodo to the edge of fire, and when the light failed, he carried it. Not for glory, but for friendship, for home, for God. Elsewhere in the hills and woodlands there were other quiet resistances. Rangers who patrolled forgotten roads, women who hid sacred texts in stone, dwarves who sealed away relics too dangerous to destroy. These acts were not recorded in song. They were not carved into statues, but they mattered. They disrupted the symmetry of evil's spread. Even in lands where the shadow had passed, there were those who remembered a different way. Farmers who turned away tacksmen, minstrels who sang of the West in secret. Children told tales of the sea, of stars, of names long vanished, but never quite erased. And through these quiet retellings, something older survived. This was not victory. It was not even hope, not in its bright form. It was something deeper, a kind of endurance that did not seek to win, only to remain, to outlast. And shadow, for all its might, is impatient. It wants conclusion. But the world is slow and stubborn and full of corners where old things wait. The Ents of Fangorn, for centuries unmoving, carried in their bark the memory of forests that once sang. Tom Bombadil, untouched by ring or ruin, sang a different tune entirely. Even the river dwellers and stone watchers, strange and half-forgotten, bore witness to a rhythm that could not be rewritten. These were not weapons, they were not shields, they were truths, unaltered by time or ambition. And in the face of shadow, a truth that endures becomes a form of defiance. Yet such defiance is not without cost. The Shire, when finally reached by the shadow, suffered not by fire, but by suffocation. Trees felled, songs silenced, food rationed, and still it survived. Because survival, in the end, is not only a matter of strength, but of remembering who one is beneath the weight. So it was that when the great wars were won elsewhere, and kings reclaimed their crowns, the small folk returned to weed their gardens, mend their fences, and tell stories. And in those stories, carried by pipe smoke and moonlight, the world healed. Not quickly, not entirely, but enough. To understand what they endured is to understand what resistance truly is, not the act of rising, but of refusing to fall, not the sound of swords, but the silence of a heart that does not yield. And if the quiet could endure, what then of those who chose to fight? Not out of duty, but defiance. What was the price they paid? What was the shape of sacrifice beneath the banners of resistance? To see that cost clearly, we must now walk beside those who resisted openly and trace the deep lingering price they bore. Some battles are fought with swords, others are endured in silence. But resistance, true resistance, asks more than bravery. It asks for the self, piece by piece, hour by hour. It strips away comfort, certainty, and sometimes even hope. And yet, men and women still chose it. They stood, knowing they might fall. They walked, knowing they might not return. Not for glory, not even for victory, but because there comes a moment, in every age, when the line between what is lived and what is allowed becomes too thin to ignore. Among the elves, the decision to resist took many forms. Some sailed west, choosing the peace of distant shores. Others stayed, not to dominate, but to defend what still remained. Gil-galad raised his standard in the last alliance, knowing that should he fall, no one else might rise in time. His crown was a burden, his sword a promise, and his death a signal that even the brightest among the firstborn were not beyond the reach of consequence. For the dwarves, resistance was quieter. It took shape in sealed gates, in hidden archives, in the quiet hammering of weapons, never meant for display. They knew the long game of evil. They had seen greed twist their own halls, and so their defiance was laced with caution. Yet when the time came, they emerged, not for conquest, but to honor old bonds. Some never returned, others returned changed. But all who marched paid a price, and the echoes of their absence hummed through stone long after. Among men the toll was most visible. The bodies fell, the cities burned, the banners turned to ash. But even deeper than these wounds was the spiritual erosion, the gradual numbing of those who had seen too much and yet could not afford to turn away. Warriors who bore no names in the histories still carried in their eyes the shape of ruin. Mothers who watched sons ride east, lit no lamps for their return. And yet they endured, they cooked, they waited, This endurance, often ignored, was itself a form of sacrifice. Not all losses are immediate. Some unfold over years, lost sleep, frayed trust, the soft distance that grows between those who left and those who stayed. In Gondor, the white tree stood as a symbol of legacy, but beneath its branches there were soldiers who no longer dreamed. In Rohan, songs still rose in the halls, but some voices did not return to join them. Even those who won, lost, Aragorn, crowned king, did not celebrate. His coronation was not a triumph, it was a memorial. Each step he took up the stone path to the throne was marked by the ghosts of those who had fallen to make that path clear. His was the crown of the reluctant ruler, heavy not with gold but with the knowledge that every decision henceforth would be weighed against the sacrifices that had made it possible. Faramir, once wounded and nearly lost, returned not to power, but to reflection. His stewardship was not of command, but of healing, of allowing Gondor to breathe again, to mourn properly. He understood that rebuilding required more than stone and timber. It required the willingness to look at what had been broken and choose not to forget it. Even Frodo, whose journey defined the axis of the world's survival, found no true peace. The ring was destroyed. Sauron had fallen, but within him something remained hollowed. The Shire was unchanged, but he was not, and so his final act of resistance was to leave, to sail away from what he had saved, because he could no longer live inside it. His sacrifice was not his journey, but his departure. This is the price of resistance. Not death alone, but transformation. Those who stood against the shadow were not left as they were. They carried traces of what they fought, echoes of burden, flashes of doubt that would never fully vanish, and yet they stood anyway. And for every named figure, there were countless unnamed villagers who hid fugitives, smiths who repaired blades under moonlight, scouts who never returned. Their sacrifices are woven into the quiet fabric of the world that followed, invisible but essential. The question is not whether resistance was worth the cost. The question is how the world honors that cost after the war ends, and how in doing so it prevents the shadow from returning, not through strength, but through remembrance. But remembrance is fragile. It fades, stories twist, symbols erode, and in time the seeds of vigilance can turn again to pride, to complacency, to hunger, for shadow does not die. It withdraws, it waits, and if the world forgets the price, it will pay it again. To see how these costs and memories gather, how they converge upon a final reckoning, we must now look toward the moment when all forces aligned, not in battle alone, but in fate, in history, in the long arc that led to the last great war. When all threads converge, they do not do so by accident. History, though often fragmented in telling, gathers its strands with deliberate weight, and in Middle-earth, There came a moment when every lingering echo, every whispered doubt, every cost borne in silence curved inward toward a single point in time, a single breath in the long song of the world. It was not just war, it was reckoning, a convergence of memory, power, and the last gambit of both hope and despair. The ring had resurfaced, but not into waiting hands. It had passed unnoticed through river, stone, and shadow, until at last it came to one who did not seek it, and in that very accident lay the one flaw in Sauron's design. He had calculated armies, alliances, legacies, but not the endurance of the overlooked. The convergence began not in battlefields, but in footsteps. Frodo, the smallest among the free peoples, walked east with a burden not even the wise could fully understand. Yet beyond him the world stirred. Sauron's armies surged from Mordor, not just with strength but with timing. He knew the west was divided. He knew the elves were departing, the dwarves retreating, and men doubted. What he could not know was that those very weaknesses had birthed something new, a strange kind of unity born not of power, but of necessity. The Fellowship, broken though it became, served as a catalyst. Aragorn, no longer merely ranger, but rising king, gathered the scattered. Legolas and Gimli, once heirs of old enmity, fought side by side. Merry and Pippin, far from home, lit fires in the hearts of ancient beings who had long slept. Gandalf returned from the depths, moved like a storm, contained, soft when needed, absolute when the line was drawn. As Minas Tirith stood under siege, the full weight of all previous choices came due. The Palantir that had broken Denethor's mind, the alliances that had faltered, the forgotten oaths of the dead, every missed step, every buried truth, surged upward in flame and ash. And yet, within that inferno, there also rose clarity. Arwen, disguised in armor, shattered prophecy with a blade. Samwise, carrying more than his own strength, bore Frodo through fire. This convergence was not a coincidence. It was the slow fulfillment of patterns laid across ages. Morgoth's pride, Sauron's planning, Isildur's weakness, even Gollum's hunger, all of it spiraled toward this final crossing of threads, where the smallest act, the least noticed will, might tilt the arc of the world. And so, while the armies of the West marched on the Black Gate, they did so not to win, but to buy time, to distract, to draw the eye outward, to the clamor of swords and the banners of defiance, while in the shadows of Mount Doom, the true war was waged in silence. Frodo, wounded in body and mind, reached the edge of his task. But the ring, always waiting, had not grown weaker. It had grown clever. It had learned him. It had whispered his name in dreams, softened its weight to suit his hand. And when the final moment came, Frodo claimed it, not in malice, not in madness, but in the exhausted certainty that he could bear it no longer. And then Gollum, twisted, pitiful, relentless. He had followed not as a villain, but as a remnant, a shadow of the ring's past, and a mirror of its future. His fall was not a twist. It was a truth long unfolding. He bit, he danced, he slipped, and in his ruin, the ring found its end, not by the will of heroes, but by the consequences of mercy once shown in pity. The tower fell, the eye broke, but the world did not cheer. It paused, it watched, as silence followed fire. As the Black Gate trembled open not in welcome but in final surrender. The convergence had passed, the center had held, but what followed was not triumph. It was stillness. For in every great unmaking, there is a moment after, the long exhale, the weight of everything that remains. Ruins must be cleared. Crowns must be worn, wounds must be named, and those who survived must decide how to remember, because convergence is not the end. It is the threshold, and beyond it lies the deeper question: what becomes of a world after the shadow recedes? What legacy remains, not of the evil defeated, but of the choices made to face it? To answer that, we must walk again through quieter lands, through halls where old songs begin again, through minds forever changed into the long light of aftermath. The silence after war is never empty. It is filled with names, with absences, with the slow work of memory returning to the places where noise once ruled. Middle-earth stood at the edge of such silence, blinking into a world remade not by glory but by exhaustion. The towers of the enemy had fallen, but their long shadows still clung to the land. For shadow does not die with its master. It lingers in ruins, in habits, in the shape of the questions left behind. Gondor crowned its king. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, walked beneath the rebuilt banners of his line, not as a conqueror, but as one who knew what had been lost to make the future possible. He ruled with memory in his voice, never forgetting that a crown is not absolution, but obligation. And in his halls, songs once silenced by fear rose again, carefully. The people did not cheer all at once. They learned to hope slowly, as if relearning an old language. Rohan mourned its fallen and reburied its kings. The fields that had once thundered with hooves now blossomed with pale flowers, planted by hands that remembered every name carved into stone. Eomer took the throne not just as a warrior, but as a steward of a people who had glimpsed the brink and chosen to return. Their songs were different now, less bold, more true. In the north, the dwarves resumed their shaping of stone. But even in the deep halls, the memory of fire lingered, for what had been lost was not only gold but kin. Their records grew thicker with names unspoken, and though few outside their gates would ever read them, they kept the memory precise. For dwarves understood better than most that legacy is not carved in wealth, but in who returns to tell the story. The elves, too, felt the weight of aftermath. Galadriel departed across the sea, her song fading into the west. The power she had guarded, the vision she had upheld, could no longer anchor the world. Lothlorien dimmed, not in defeat, but in release. The age of elves was ending, and with it, the era when beauty alone could hold the darkness at bay. And in the Shire, where war had passed like a distant dream, the aftermath arrived differently. Crops regrew, trees were replanted, but something had shifted. The hobbits who returned were not the same as those who left. Frodo, in particular, bore a wound that no healer could touch. He smiled, he walked, he wrote, but within him the echo of the ring remained. Not as power, but as absence, a hollow space where burden had lived too long. He could not rest, not truly, and so his final choice was not to rule or to teach, but to leave, to sail, to seek the stillness that Middle-earth, for all its healing, could no longer offer him. It was not a defeat, it was an acknowledgement that some scars are sacred, not meant to be hidden or erased, but carried elsewhere. Yet for all that had been lost, the world remembered. The trees grew tall again. Children born in the years after the war heard stories and asked questions. The memory of evil became the mortar of new peace, not feared, but understood. For to forget shadow is to invite its return, but to remember it rightly is to guard against its subtle return in different forms. The lands began to speak again in new voices. Trade resumed, alliances formed. The lands scarred by orc-forged flame gave birth to green once more. But even in this renewal, there was an awareness, a quiet clarity that what had been averted was not inevitable, that it had required not one hero, but many, and more than that, it had required those who bore no titles, who made no speeches, who simply chose again and again to do what was right in the face of what was easier. The ruins of Barad-dûr were left untouched, not rebuilt, not cleansed. They remained as a scar visible to the world, a reminder that power, once worshipped, must never again be pursued at any cost. The silence there was deeper than wind. It was the silence of unlearning. So the world moved forward, not in triumph, but in reflection. It did not forget its dead. It did not erase its failures. Instead, it wove them into its future, stone upon stone, song upon song. Their aftermath was not the end. It was the soil in which the next age was planted. But even soil remembers. Even ash holds seed, and while the shadow had passed, the memory of its voice still echoed in the distant corners of the world, where silence can one day turn into something else. To hold that memory without fear requires more than lore or sword. It requires wisdom, patience, and a deeper understanding of how shadow moves, not only in battle, but in thought, in desire, in forgetting. To reach that understanding, we must return to the beginning, to the question of fate, of will, of what it means to walk in a world shaped by long darkness and choose light anyway. Some truths cannot be told at the height of noise. They arrive later, when the clamor has faded and the ground is still, when the fires have burned low and only smoke curls upward into a sky, suddenly vast again. It is in this long quiet that the soul of Middle-earth was asked to look inward, not for danger, but for meaning. For what had happened was not only a war, not only a fall and a victory, but a culmination of forces older than memory. And the question remained, had fate driven these events? Or had the will of individuals turned the tide? Frodo had sailed. The ring was gone. But the shape of the world had changed. Not just in maps and borders, but in its pulse. There was a weariness to the land, and yet a clarity too. Trees that had bent beneath dread now stood straight. Rivers that had flowed heavy with ash now glittered clean. But these were not simply signs of renewal. They were reflections of a world that had survived, not without scars, but with the willingness to remember. And in that remembrance, patterns emerged. Not just of battles, but of choices, of figures who, at critical moments, had faced silence and filled it, not with fear, but with decision. Elrond, who allowed the ring-bearer to be chosen not by rank, but by readiness. Faramir, who let go of desire when he could have claimed. Théoden, who rode toward death not to win, but to keep a promise. None of these acts were inevitable. Each carried risk and pain. And yet they formed the turning points from which the greater pattern unfolded. The idea of fate had always haunted Middle-earth. From the music of the Ainur, which laid the world's first melody, to the prophecies whispered among elves and woven into the songs of men, there had always been a sense that events were watched, even shaped by something beyond sight. But if fate existed, it did not dictate. It offered outlines, not outcomes. The melody was deep, but each voice could rise or fall within it. And it was in those subtle choices, those resistances, those refusals, those sacrifices, that the destiny of the world was written anew. Sauron believed in inevitability, in domination not just of land, but of possibility. He saw the future as a thing to be bent into his image, his rhythm, but it was precisely the unpredictable, the unexpected kindness, the stubborn resilience of small hearts that unraveled his vision. Shadow cannot account for mercy. It cannot interpret selflessness. It cannot see the strength in those who do not wish for power. And so the fate of Middle-earth was not claimed by strength of arms, but by restraint. Not by heroes seizing thrones, but by travelers letting go of burdens. The greatest power was not the ring, but the decision to carry it, step by agonizing step, with no promise of return, The echo of this truth rippled outward. In kingdoms reborn, leaders began to rule not from fear of the past, but from understanding of its cost. Laws were written not only for safety but for dignity. Stories were preserved, not of glory alone, but of loss, of failure, of the thin line walked by those who dared to stand. Among the elves, the choice to depart was not abandonment, but trust. Trust that the world could go on without them, that the memory of light they carried could now live in others. In the dwarves, there grew a deeper care for what lay below, not just wealth, but memory, old places, old names. And in men there was both hunger and humility, hunger to build, to reclaim, and the humility to do so with eyes turned not only toward the sky, but back toward the soil. Even in the Shire, though peace returned, it was a different kind of peace. It had been earned. Not all understood what had been kept at bay, but all felt it, that something vast had passed them by, and yet left them safer. The Red Book was written not just to remember Frodo, but to remind all who would come after that evil often wears familiar faces, and that the smallest heart can hold the longest light. So the question remains, was it fate, or was it will? The answer, like most truths, is both and neither. The music may have begun the world, but it was the choices within it, the refusals, the renunciations, the unlikely loyalties that gave it shape. Middle-earth endured not because it was protected, but because it remembered. And in that remembrance lies its strength. The memory of darkness, the long shadow of choice, the echo of silence, answered with resolve. And so we come to the twilight of this story. Not the end, but the soft dimming of a long age. A time when the world must decide how to carry what it now understands, what to honor, what to forgive, and what to watch for in the long years ahead. There is a silence that comes not from absence, but from fulfillment. A hush that settles over a world, not because it has ended, but because it has seen itself clearly. Middle-earth, in the twilight of the Third Age, stood within that silence. The great wars were over. The towers had fallen. The fires had cooled. But the air still carried the scent of everything that had come before, the sorrow, the resilience, the brief flickers of light in long corridors of shadow. The twilight did not arrive suddenly. It drifted in like mist over the water, gradual and soft. Elves departed, their ships cutting paths across the sea like silver blades. The memory of their songs lingered in trees and stones. In the way moonlight touched leaves at dusk, their going was not a loss, but a passing of weight. Their age had fulfilled its shape. What they had held in beauty, in sorrow, in vigilance, now moved on, leaving the world to men, to time, to the unknown. The dwarves returned to their mountains, deeper than before, more thoughtful in their work. They no longer carved with hunger, but with reverence. Some halls would never be reopened, some treasures would never be reclaimed, but they understood now that not all things hidden are meant to be found, that some relics, some legacies, belong only to the past. The kingdoms of men stirred in new rhythm. Gondor rose beneath Aragorn's steady hand, not as an empire but as a garden of renewal. He ruled not from victory but from balance, a knowledge of how close the world had come to breaking. His reign was not loud nor absolute. It was watchful, deliberate, a quiet commitment to holding open a space where hope might grow, if given time. The Shire, cradled in green, thrived again. But it, too, had changed. Hobbits no longer believed themselves untouched by the wider world. Their tales became deeper, edged with truth. Children heard of black riders, of a wizard's fireworks that had once lit up more than skies, and though most would live and die between hedgerows and harvests, There was now a thread of understanding, soft and strong, woven through their peace, that the world had almost been lost, and that they had mattered in saving it. And still, beyond all this, the land remembered. Shadows no longer ruled, but they lingered in form, crumbled ruins, cursed paths, swords buried beneath ash. Evil had not been unmade. It had been diminished, scattered, made costly. What had truly changed was the world's understanding of it, no longer an enemy to be slain, but a force to be watched, to be resisted, even in peace, especially in peace. This was the new vigilance, not one of swords, but of memory, the understanding that evil often returns not with banners, but with suggestions, that it thrives not only in war, but in ambition, in forgetting, in the subtle erosion of care. The dark does not always come roaring. Sometimes it waits for the gate left unguarded. But now there were those who watched. Rangers still walked the wild places. Law was studied again, not to summon old powers, but to understand their consequences. Even the quiet folk listened more closely to stories. Not for fear, but for awareness. The world had become wiser, though not without cost. In the end, this was the gift of twilight. Not rest, but perspective. Not closure, but continuity. A recognition that the Great War had not ended the story. It had only revealed the stakes more clearly. And in that soft light, in the waning of the Third Age, something else was born. A peace not built on ignorance, but on choice. A peace where sorrow was acknowledged, not denied. Where beauty was cherished, not possessed. Where power, once idolized, was now handled with reverence or let go altogether. Middle-earth would go on. New kings would rise. New lands would be explored. And somewhere, deep in forest or cave, old evils might stir again. But they would not find the world unprepared, for the memory had taken root. This, then, is the twilight of shadow, not its obliteration but its understanding. The light does not erase the dark. It gives it shape, outlines its edges, so that it can no longer hide. And so the story ends as all true stories do, not with a single moment, but with a shift, a turning of the wind, a sigh carried across the hills, a voice somewhere beginning to tell again what happened when the world almost fell and did not. And in that telling, the future begins. There are ages that begin with thunder, and others that begin with breath. The fourth age of Middle-earth began in silence, a silence not empty, but full of memory, full of cost, full of the weight that comes after the turning of something vast. No horns heralded its dawn, no great light split the sky. Instead, it began with footsteps, a king walking through the streets of his reclaimed city, a gardener planting again in his old soil, an old friend boarding a ship he could no longer delay. The evil realms had fallen, but their echo did not vanish. Like sound in a vast hall, their reverberation lingered in stone, in speech, in the careful glances exchanged when night fell. Barad-dûr was gone, but its logic had not been forgotten. That power, once unleashed, rewrites even those who defeat it. And so the world moved forward cautiously, reverently, like one walking through a temple of ruin, careful not to disturb the dust. In the days that followed, the question shifted, no longer, will we survive? Now it became, how will we live with what we have done? For every victory was stitched with memory, and those memories could not be buried. The ring was gone, yes, but the path it had carved through heart and realm had changed the soil beneath all things. And yet it was from this very soil that new roots began to grow, not quickly, not confidently, but persistently. In Gondor, Aragorn ruled with eyes that had seen too much to ever fully rest. He governed not as one who had conquered evil, but as one who had once touched the edge of its allure. His laws were tempered with humility, his justice quiet, never absolute. He welcomed not only soldiers and nobles, but wanderers and poets. The halls of Minas Tirith were lit again, not only by torches but by voices. In Rohan, the wind carried new music through the grasses. Erwin, once shield maiden, now healer, tended wounds that steel could never touch. She understood the deep silence of those who had returned different, those who smiled too little, who flinched at memory. She did not try to mend what could not be undone. She sat with them. She listened. That, too, became a kind of healing. Even in the east and south lands long under Mordor's sway, the stirrings of change began, slowly, uneasily. The scars ran deep, and trust did not rise like sun over mountain. But stories traveled, that Gondor did not burn their fields, that the West had not come to claim, but to release, and in marketplaces and thresholds cautious hands began to open. It would take lifetimes, but the cycle had broken. Yet it was the smallest places that revealed most clearly the shape of this new age. The Shire, nestled still in its green cradle, bloomed brighter than before. Not because it had forgotten, but because it remembered wisely. Its peace was no longer innocence, it was choice. The hobbits rebuilt what had been broken, but not exactly as it was. They left room for the new, for the tales they had once dismissed as distant. They honored their own now quietly, in stone markers and in shared harvests. And Samwise, now mayor and father, planted the seeds Galadriel had gifted him. Trees that shimmered faintly under moonlight, that hummed with something older than the world knew. He did not speak of her often, but when he did, he always smiled the same way, like someone remembering not just a person, but a promise. In Rivendell, the halls grew quieter. Fewer lights in the windows, fewer songs. The elves were departing, and the knowledge they carried went with them, not lost but given, carefully, to those who chose to carry it forward. Books were sealed, lore entrusted. The world would not forget, though its memories might shift with time. And in places where no banners flew, where no great events had passed, something even rarer occurred: contentment, the quiet filling in of what shadow had hollowed out. Laughter returned, rivers ran clear, children asked questions whose answers did not need to begin with blood. This was not an ending. Middle-earth would face other storms. It would make other mistakes, but it had passed through fire and not turned to ash. It had chosen to remember, and in remembering it had reclaimed its shape, not as it was before, but as it was meant to be, flawed, striving, enduring. The evil realms had twisted its destiny, yes, but the will of many, measured not in might, but in mercy, had uncoiled that thread, had held it steady, had written, not a perfect story, but a true one. And so the twilight deepened, not with fear, but with rest, with eyes turned towards stars that had watched silently through every age. And somewhere in that quiet, a new tale began, softly, unseen, carried on wind and memory, waiting to be told.